Hello, everyone. So today we will be discussing the academic article, The EU's Role in Climate Change Negotiations, From Leader to Leadiator, written by Karin and Ole. And today, Johanna and I, Jason, we will be discussing and dissecting this academic article for you guys. So we will start off by the author's research question in this paper. The first research question is how to explain the European Union's decline as a climate change leader at the Copenhagen summit. And the second research question is how to understand the partial revival of its leadership position at the Durban climate summit. So the difference between the two summits is that for the Copenhagen summit, the European Union didn't perform that well, quoted as a political earthquake for the European Union's leadership role. And for the Durban Climate Summit, we see a revival of European Union's leadership role again after the Copenhagen Summit, after they reviewed their mistakes from the past.
The main argument of the paper is that a global shift in both aggregate and issue-specific structural power towards emerging economies at the expense of the European Union has led the European Union to change and adapt its strategy and position in international climate change negotiations. In order to illustrate this, the authors used the Copenhagen and the Durban summit and state that in the Copenhagen summit, the EU was pursuing a directional and ideational leadership role, which was based on normative aspirations, and after the basically failure at the Copenhagen summit, changed the role to the one of a leadiator in the Durban summit by adapting a more realistic and pragmatic role and acting as a leader and mediator, which together gets to the term leadiator, and the whole role and performance of the European Union adapted to the global shift in powers.
So next we will be discussing about two theories or concepts that the author uses in his paper. The first concept is shifts in aggregate and issue-specific structural power. And the second concept is link between domestic politics and climate change policy. I will be discussing about the first concept, and Johanna will be discussing about the second concept. So what is the shift in aggregate and issue-specific structural power? Well, according to the author, for the past 20 years, there has been a significant shift in the economic power of the world. So basically the BRIC countries, which is represented by Brazil, Russia, India, and China, nowadays, they compose 42% of the global population, almost 15% of the world's GDP, and 13% of the world trade. And this significance is reflected by the influence that these countries and also other emerging economic countries or developing countries exert in global negotiations. Global negotiations of issue-specific power, which is the influence wielded in a certain field of negotiation. So in this case, it would be climate change, the influence these countries wield in the field of climate change. And how is that reflected? Well, these countries generate over 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in 2008, compared to 20% in 1998. And we see that US, China, and other emerging economies are really the countries that matter in any lasting climate solution. Because if these countries do not agree with climate change policies, then this agenda will not be set forth from the EU, because these countries are also responsible for the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore, we see that geopolitical power has tilted towards these major developing countries represented by BRIC and also South Africa. The author further develops this concept with the unanimity or the consensus rule, wherein he states that a reformist actor that demands change has less bargaining power than a conservative player. So in this scenario, the reformist actor will be the EU that demands change. And the conservative player would be, for example, China or other countries alike. So these countries would have more bargaining power because they are the one that needs to adopt the demands that the EU places forth. And we see that in contemporary climate change negotiations, if these countries do not agree, these countries, US and China, which are also dubbed as the veto players, if they, without their consent, no deal can be made. So they are the essential contributors to any successful global climate agreement. So how does this affect EU's position in climate change negotiations? Well, after the failure of the Copenhagen summit, there was a need to review for strategies in terms of leadership, bridge building, and coalition making by the EU. So we see improvement in the Durban summit with the creation of new coalitions, for example, the EU, AOSIS, African Coalition.
The authors point out that each of the main actors has and seeks to pursue their own national preferences, principles, visions, and goals. And I will just illustrate them shortly for you. So the European Union, as the first of the three main actors, which also include the United States and China, seeks to put forward legally binding agreements with defined targets and timetables, has a strong preference for multilateralism, for example, within the United Nations, and scientific evidence-based decision-making. The United States, as the second very important actor, prefer voluntary actions and has a strong focus on the well-being of the US economy. The US is moreover very skeptical vis-a-vis the common but different obligations and multilateralism in general, and has a preference for bilateral agreements and smaller forms of negotiations and coalitions. China, as the third major player, has a strong preference for voluntary actions for developing countries and mandatory actions for developed countries. National sovereignty is at the heart of the Chinese approach, and China seeks to avoid any kind of intervention into domestic affairs. China is in strong favor of the common but different obligations and urges the developed states to assist developing countries in adapting and mitigating climate change. Generally, the Chinese approach is based on the historic responsibility for climate change, which obviously lies with the developed countries.
And the author further develops this concept by stating that there is a link between domestic politics and climate change policy, which is illustrated through the examples of EU and the US.
So for the EU, the authors point out that the main problem is a disunity between the member states, which affects the position in negotiations, like climate change negotiations, in three ways. First, by divide and rule, which basically means that member states might be played off against each other, thereby weakening the voice of the EU as an individual entity. Second, that the incoherence between words and deeds, which basically means that the EU cannot implement promises, or that outsiders receive different messages from different EU member states. And both of the mentioned problems lead to credibility problems of the European Union, which is obviously not what is desirable as an actor in international negotiations.
So with the example of the US, the author shows us that US was quite active with regards to climate change negotiation leadership role throughout the 1970s to 1980s, wherein they actually led a treaty to protect the ozone layer, where the EU was then a veto player. But then all of this changed significantly during the 1990s when the Clinton administration couldn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol because of a bipartisan opposition within the Congress. So there is an internal conflict within the US politics. With regards to with regards to Obama, there was also much hope for Obama, but he also faced a lot of Congress opposition. So the author uses 4 sources of empirical data, which he explicitly states in the introduction section of this paper. The first source are primary sources. The second is interviews with COP delegates. The third are participant observation at UN climate summits. And the fourth is secondary sources, such as commentaries on climate policy after Durban, and also scholarly literature on climate policy.
The authors only use very little numerical data, and this is a small point of criticism from our side on the paper, because we think that the argument of the author could be supported and also made much stronger if they were provide more data and quantitative analysis.
So we now move on to the implications of this paper to our wider understanding of political economy. And the first implication that we came up with, that we thought about, is the connection of this paper with Olson's paper, The Logic of Collective Action. So in that paper, she talks about this paradox that large groups composed of rational individuals, firms, or in this scenario, these countries, they do not act and will not act in their group interest. So we see that this group, as in this, the goal, the aim of the EU to come up with a multilateral organization to tackle climate change, it's quite difficult. And it's also quite expensive because of the heterogeneous nature of this group, wherein each country or each coalition act in their own interest, as shown or as stated by Johanna in her previous slide, of the different goals of, for example, EU, US, and China. So it's hard to organize a collective action in this entity that strives for global climate change negotiation. And in her paper, she also states that political entrepreneurs who attempt to organize collective action is more likely to succeed if they strive to organize in relatively homogeneous groups. So we see that homogeneous groups are more efficient, and they can also act more decisively because they are literally homogeneous. And the second implication is the efficiency of the market, which I will use US as an example. So in 1997, with the Byrd-Hagel Senate resolution, the US explicitly states that they will not ratify a climate agreement that threatens the US economy. So in this scenario, we see the US tilting more towards the efficiency of the market spectrum, the economic spectrum, as opposed to the political spectrum, because they view the significance of the economy much more important as compared to the discourse of climate change.
And thirdly, we have linked the whole paper to the liberal intergovernmentalism theory, which basically says that in international bargaining, actors often only succeed in reaching the lowest common denominator outcome because each actor is driven by national preferences, which we have also outlined beforehand for the EU, the US, and China. And we can also see that the success in climate change negotiations was really limited because no really ambitious goals were reached. And we can also see, for example, with the Copenhagen Accord, that due to the states not reaching an agreement, only a non-binding political agreement was made.
And we can also see that it's quite difficult because of the heterogeneity nature of this group, because every country has their own national interest. Therefore, it's really hard to come up with a collective consensus. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and we hope you have a very good day. Thank you.